Okay, this is a story of two very different women, and I just want to accentuate first of all that I'm going to do a brief history of bowling in New Waterford, because part of our research or part of having this night is to tell the stories about people. That's what's fascinating, the stories about their sport or about the people themselves. So this is a story of two very different women who were united in their love of bowling. They bowled at a time when women were expected to stay home and raise their kids and run a household. Remember those days? Between the two of them, Maddie Kennedy and Kaye Cormier-Philpott produced 21 children. And ironically, that's not why they're being honored tonight. Ironically, both were quite young when they were widowed, leaving them with a lot of responsibilities. When we first decided to honor a female bowler, and anybody who knows me knows I've been trying to get these females through, there were many names that came up, and not all of us on the committee knew a lot about bowling. Alice Ryan, Teresa Cousins, Renee Coakley, Sadie Marsh, Minnie McGuinness, Eileen McIsaac, Marie Dugutt, and Betty Kelly, to name a few. But it soon became apparent through our research that both Kaye and Maddie were standout bowlers year after year. They were the two who were consistently picked up by other teams in the area to compete at the provincial level each year. Thus, they are the two we have chosen to honor here tonight. Their styles and characters could not be more different, but their love and domination of their sport was irrefutable. I want to first speak a bit about the history of bowling in New Waterford, and a lot of this information came from Tommy McNeil, who managed both the Bowmore Lanes in New Waterford and Sydney for many years. I have to confess that I originally thought he had died, as I hadn't heard his name in many years. So I called his son, Tom Jr., and asked, "Did your father ever keep any scrapbooks from the bowling leagues in town?" And he said, "Just a minute, I'll ask him." This led to a detailed interview with Tommy Sr., who was a wealth of information on the sport of bowling. He is one of the people who I would liken to a library burning down if he does not impart his knowledge before he does pass away. And it's these stories that we want to tell. Yes, we want to honor the athletes, but more importantly, to preserve the stories about them and the sport they loved. You'll hear Tommy's name mentioned many times throughout our discourse. Candlepin bowling is a sport that used the taller pins, and they were more tapered like a candle, as opposed to the short, fat pins used in 5-pin bowling. The most unique thing about candlepin bowling is that you can play the dead wood, meaning the pins that were already down, to your advantage. This meant that if you could hit them hard enough and in the right spot, you could take out all the other pins. This was the only form of bowling that allowed this, and it required real skill and accuracy to use the dead wood to your advantage. Tommy said that Maddie Kennedy was a past master at this technique, mainly because she was a very powerful bowler who could really scatter the pins. But, he added, it didn't take Kaye Cormier long to figure out this advantage, and she worked diligently at strategizing exactly where the pins should be hit. The original bowling alleys in town were over Udovan's hardware store in the 1930s. When it became very disruptive to business, 4 new alleys were opened at the French Club, owned and operated by Fred Gregor throughout the late 1930s and 40s. These alleys employed the pin boys, who had to be quite nimble and able to jump away from the scattering pins. Most pin boys didn't last long at the job, as it was quite frightening and resulted in some bad injuries. Tommy McNeil then became a part of a group of 15 men who loved this sport, and they decided to invest some money in bowling. They eventually ended up building and owning 2 alleys, the Sydney Bowmore Lanes at the shopping centre on Prince Street and the Waterford Bowmore Lanes. Tommy managed both alleys for many years, and both featured the automatic pin setters that were all the rage. The original group of men consisted of Fred and Harry Gregor, Lonnie Bates, Hughie Morrison, Jackie and Jimmy McPherson, Harvey Hyson Sr., Irving Schwartz, Billy Burke, Bertie Nearing, and Ranald and Bernie McDonald. This coalition resulted in the Waterford Bowmore Lanes being opened on November the 11th, 1959, which heralded in a new era of bowling in town. At first, the leagues were predominantly made up of men, but it soon caught on with the women, who had finally found a relatively safe sport that they could play as well. Imagine the escape that this provided for women who were saddled all day in and day out with the responsibilities of child rearing and housekeeping. It was as if another world had opened up for them, and they took to it like ducks to water. Many women remember that Tommy McNeil was very fair to them. He kept the rates low for the women, recognizing that most didn't work outside the home, and in return they filled up the alleys for him. This is the story of 2 of those women who managed to excel at the sport of bowling despite the many obstacles that they had to overcome to accomplish this. So, Kaye DeVoe Cormier was born August 13, 1921, and died 85 years later in 2007. She married Henry Cormier, and they lived in his family home on 9th Street in town throughout their married life and well beyond. Kaye graduated from the Waterford School of Nursing in 1941. From 1942 to 1956, she had 11 children. She began bowling in her early 20s. For her, it was the start of a lifelong love of the sport, and she kept at it until she was 65. Kaye did not have an easy life. She worked predominantly as a newborn and maternity nurse throughout her career, which spanned 45 years, right up until she was 65. In the early 70s, she recognized the need for trained nursing home workers, and she taught the home nursing program for almost 10 years until it became a government certified program. She also received an award for 40 years of volunteer work with the Red Cross. In 1965, she was 44 years old when her husband died at home on the couch while she was at work, and we can only imagine how that increased her duties and responsibilities. But Kaye regained her stride and became both mother and father to the children. She was, to say the least, one of the better-known personalities in town, and Kaye was always there if anyone needed anything. Throughout all these setbacks and added responsibilities, Kaye remained an avid bowler. In many ways, it was probably her savior. She initially bowled on Tuesday nights in Sydney at Hasham's Alleys on Charlotte Street and on Thursdays in New Waterford. She became involved in the mixed leagues after that. The ladies' leagues ran from June to September, but the Glace Bay Alleys stayed open for the summer, and Kaye would take advantage of this at every opportunity. Transportation was always a problem for most women, as very few of them drove, and their husbands couldn't drive them as they were often the babysitters. They were also ahead of their time. Kaye's daughter Jenny told me the story of Kaye and Eileen McIsaac going 5 times to take their driver's test, just so they could drive themselves to bowling. Kaye said the examiner finally gave them their license just to get rid of them. Kaye and many other women were often pregnant while they were bowling, and they would find it difficult to tie their shoelaces. The men in the mixed leagues, who recognized that they needed these ladies on their team, would say, "You get yourselves down here and we'll tie your laces for you." Kaye always wanted to accentuate the fact that she was a female bowler, and she always bowled in a skirt and lifted one side of her skirt ever so slightly as she released the ball. What that was all about, we'll never know. She also always bowled in her signature red bowling shoes. Her release of the ball was not overly powerful, but yet she could outbowl most of the female bowlers and hold her own with the men as well. She became adept at putting up single string scores without a mark, which meant a high score was achieved without a strike or a spare throughout the string. Many bowlers aspired to this in addition to their other records, but very few were as successful at it as Kaye. Kaye and Maddie were both frequently added to the Sydney Comets roster to help them compete at the provincial level. Our research showed us that this occurred as early as 1958, when they helped win back-to-back championships. They were runner-up for the next 4 years, then repeated as champions in 1963 and once more in 1968. In the late 60s, Kaye began entering her own New Waterford team into provincial playoffs, the New Waterford Novarites. The provincial tournaments were always held around the long weekend in May in many different locales throughout the province. Although the Novarites never won a provincial championship, it was on this team that Kaye achieved her crowning glory. On May 23, 1969, at the Sydney Bowlmore Lanes, she bowled a high triple of 420, including singles of 144, 120, and 156, which also became the high single for the tournament. To put this in perspective, most of the female bowlers would aim for a triple of 350, while the men aimed for a 400. It was unheard of for a woman to bowl over 400. And Tommy McNeil told me he's never heard of a female bowler in Atlantic Canada who's beat that 420 score in candlepin bowling to this day. And I just want to thank Kaye's daughter Jenny, who brought the original write-up from the Cape Breton Post 50 years ago, and the 3 original score sheets from that bowling event. They're over on the wall if anyone wants to look at them after. Kaye's daughter Jenny told me many stories of her mom's tenacity when it came to bowling, and one of them revolved around that 420 score. She said the night before there was a banquet where drink tickets were given out freely, and Kaye, who loved to socialize, took advantage of that situation. After she bowled her first string the next day, she was a little under the weather. You could replace a bowler legally any time before the 4th string, and Kaye wanted out. But after the 2nd string, it was apparent that something special was happening. So her teammates pumped her with aspirin and refused to replace her. They cheered her on, and as others realized what was happening, the whole tournament stopped to cheer her on as well. The result was the magical 420 score, the first score over 400 ever recorded in a ladies' provincial bowling tournament, which was understandably the epitome of Kaye's bowling career. Jenny also shared another amusing story that highlights the tenacity with which Kaye bowled and her supreme love of the sport. Around 1956, she was pregnant with her last child, Pauline, and in fact she was overdue when the tournament came up in Sydney that year. Well, she packed her suitcase and left the bowl in Sydney and said, "There's hospitals in Sydney if I need one." When the tournament was over, she returned home and said, "Well, I guess this kid's going to be born in New Waterford after all." Kaye loved to bowl, or as Jenny put it, she lived to bowl. All the ladies look forward to the nights out, the trips, and the year-end banquets. I have no doubt that this was a huge escape for many of them from the responsibilities they faced on a daily basis. Throughout my research, it was apparent that Kaye was a top-notch bowler who well deserved the accolades that came her way. Every single article I could find on ladies bowling listed Kaye with a high single, triple, high average, or that she led her team to victory whenever she bowled. I will suffice to say that she completely dominated at her chosen sport. Eventually, the medals, trophies, and other hardware that she won began to take over her home, and both she and Maddie redonated them to youth bowling leagues in the area in hopes of renewing interest for bowling in the younger crowd. But the glory of Kaye's generation of bowlers was not to be repeated, as bowling slowly started to die out when the next generation did not follow it up. More women in the workforce, women started moving away from home. There are numerous reasons why it didn't catch on, but it's hard to believe that bowling is virtually non-existent as a competitive sport in Atlantic Canada today. In 1979, Kaye eventually eloped with a fellow bowler, Philpott, but most people in New Waterford still refer to her as the immortal Kaye Cormier. Nothing ever fizzed Kaye at work because she always had bowling to look forward to. It was like the pot of gold at the end of her rainbow. She was a keen and fearless competitor who used her renowned skills and strategies as a bowler to forge a social life for herself as well. So tonight, I am bursting with pride to honor these two very different yet very worthy female bowlers who both finessed their way to the top of their sport. It is my great privilege and with utmost pleasure that I now call upon Kaye's daughter Jenny and her son Paul Kevin to come up on behalf of the family to accept the plaque and help us welcome her into the New Waterford Sports Heritage Hall of Fame for 2016.